Power corrupts, but death equalizes. In the opulent halls of Versailles, where golden mirrors reflected the glory of absolute monarchy, a stench was beginning to spread. It wasn't the perfume of roses or the incense of chapel prayers. It was something far more sinister, something that would transform the most magnificent king in European history into a rotting monument to human frailty. The year was 1715, and Louis XIV lay dying in agony. But this wasn't the peaceful passing of a beloved monarch surrounded by grieving subjects. This was a descent into horror that would shock even the most hardened courtiers who had witnessed decades of royal excess. The Sun King, who had once commanded armies and bent nations to his will, was now imprisoned in his own decaying flesh, his body turning against him in the most grotesque ways imaginable. What you're about to hear isn't the sanitized version found in history textbooks. This is the raw, unfiltered truth about how the most powerful man in France died screaming in his own filth. His leg blackened with gangrene, his body consumed by infections that no amount of royal privilege could cure. The man who had declared himself the center of the universe was about to discover that bacteria don't bow to kings. But to understand the horror of Louis's final days, we must first grasp the magnificent lie he had spent his entire life constructing. This wasn't just the death of a man. This was the collapse of an illusion that had held Europe spellbound for over 7 decades. Picture this: September 5th, 1638. A child is born who will never know what it means to be ordinary. By the age of 5, little Louis has already been crowned King of France, anointed with holy oil, and declared God's representative on earth. But this isn't some medieval fairy tale about divine right. This is the calculated creation of a political weapon disguised as a human being. The young Louis was sculpted like a piece of marble. Every gesture rehearsed, every word measured for maximum impact. He didn't walk into rooms. He made entrances that shifted the very atmosphere around him. Visitors from foreign courts wrote breathlessly about his presence, describing how this tall, commanding figure seemed to radiate authority from his very pores. Even his enemies admitted there was something almost supernatural about the way he commanded attention. As he matured, Louis understood something that most rulers never grasp. Perception is reality, and reality can be manufactured. He didn't just govern France, he became France. Every morning, dozens of nobles competed for the honor of watching him wake up, of handing him his silk stockings, of witnessing the divine ritual of the king's daily resurrection. This wasn't ceremony for ceremony's sake. This was psychological warfare on a national scale. Versailles itself was Louis's masterpiece of manipulation. Built from swampland and sheer willpower, this impossible palace served as both prison and paradise for the French nobility. By forcing them to live under his roof, to compete for his attention like children begging for scraps, he transformed potential rivals into decorative pets. They spent their fortunes on elaborate costumes just to catch his eye for a moment, bankrupting themselves in pursuit of royal favor. The king dictated fashion like a general commanding troops. When he wore high heels, every man at court hobbled on elevated shoes. When he powdered his hair white, 1,000 wigs followed suit. When he declared that only certain colors could be worn on certain days, the silk merchants of Lyon worked overtime to meet demand. This wasn't vanity, it was control refined to an art form. But perhaps most brilliantly, Louis made his own body into a stage for statecraft. He conducted meetings from his bed, not out of laziness, but because it forced everyone else to approach him as supplicants. Ministers had to lean in to hear his whispered commands, creating an intimate theater of power that made even the mightiest nobles feel like servants in his presence. The irony is staggering. The man who would die in the most undignified circumstances imaginable had spent his entire life constructing the most elaborate performance of dignity in human history. Every meal was a ceremony, every walk through the gardens a procession, every conversation a carefully choreographed dance of deference and authority. Yet beneath this glittering surface, cracks were already beginning to show. By the late 1680s, the Sun King's light was starting to dim. His once powerful frame was betraying him in ways that no amount of makeup or elaborate costumes could hide. Chronic pain racked his digestive system, leaving him pale and sweating during important ceremonies. Hemorrhoids made standing unbearable, though he refused to admit weakness to anyone. His teeth, once white and perfect, had rotted to black stumps that made his breath reek like a charnel house. Foreign ambassadors learned to breathe through their mouths during audiences, though they dared not show their discomfort. The king's physicians prescribed increasingly desperate treatments, but nothing could stop the slow decay that was consuming their patient from within. The royal diet certainly wasn't helping matters. Kitchen records reveal meals that would make modern doctors weep. Louis insisted on extravagant feasts that began with multiple soups and ended with brandied fruits, with course after course of rich meats and heavy sauces in between. A typical dinner might include several types of game, elaborate pâtés, and desserts soaked in alcohol. This gluttony, combined with his increasingly sedentary lifestyle, turned digestion into daily torture. But it was the ulcers on his legs that would ultimately become his downfall. What started as minor sores gradually expanded into gaping wounds that refused to heal. The royal physicians tried everything their limited knowledge could suggest: daily lancing, heated cloths soaked in spirits, constant cauterization that filled his chambers with the smell of burning flesh. They opened new incisions when old ones festered, rubbing his skin raw with ash, salt, and vinegar until it peeled away in strips. The wounds grew larger and darker, turning purple, then black, with a stench that rose like a warning to anyone who dared approach. Yet still, Louis insisted on maintaining the elaborate rituals that had defined his reign. Courtiers learned to position themselves upwind during audiences, though none would dare suggest that anything was amiss with their divine monarch. As the king's body failed, his mind began to follow. The man who had once outmaneuvered the craftiest ministers now struggled to focus during council meetings. He became obsessed with omens, interpreting minor setbacks as signs of divine displeasure. Paranoia crept in like poison, making him suspicious of longtime allies and convinced that enemies lurked behind every tapestry. The transformation was as tragic as it was inevitable. The Sun King, who had spent his life as the center of attention, now found himself trapped in a failing body that no amount of royal privilege could repair. The stage was set for one of history's most horrific royal deaths, a descent into agony that would strip away every pretense and reveal the rotting reality beneath the golden facade. What happened next would shock even those who thought they had seen everything in the brutal theater of absolute monarchy. The king, who had lived like a god, was about to die like the most wretched of mortals, his body consuming itself from within, while his terrified court could only watch and pray that the nightmare would end. The year 1705 marked a turning point in Louis's decline, though few at court dared acknowledge what they were witnessing. The king, who had once danced until dawn, now required assistance simply to rise from his throne. His famous morning ceremonies, once theatrical displays of divine authority, had become grotesque pantomimes where servants struggled to dress a body that seemed to shrink daily beneath layers of silk and brocade. The ulcer on his left leg had become something altogether more sinister. What physicians initially dismissed as a minor irritation had evolved into a crater of blackened flesh that pulsed with its own malevolent rhythm. The wound measured nearly 6 inches across, deep enough that courtiers whispered you could see bone gleaming white at its center. No amount of bandaging could contain the seepage that stained his stockings and left wet marks on the marble floors of Versailles. Dr. Guy Crescent Fagan, the king's principal physician, had exhausted every remedy in his considerable arsenal. He applied poultices of ground pearls mixed with unicorn horn powder, believing these precious substances might draw out the corruption. When that failed, he tried mercury treatments that left Louis's skin mottled and his hands trembling uncontrollably. The good doctor even resorted to placing live pigeons, cut in half while still warm, directly onto the wound, convinced that the bird's life force might somehow transfer to his royal patient. Each treatment brought fresh horror. The king's screams during the daily lancing sessions could be heard through the thick walls of his private apartments, causing nervous courtiers to quicken their pace in the corridors outside. Servants found themselves drawing straws to determine who would empty the king's chamber pots, as the contents had become so foul that even hardened palace workers vomited at the sight. Yet perhaps most disturbing was Louis's desperate attempt to maintain normalcy. Even as his body betrayed him in the most fundamental ways, he insisted on conducting the elaborate rituals that had defined his reign. The mourning lever continued, though now nobles had to approach his bed while breathing through perfumed handkerchiefs. State dinners proceeded on schedule, with the king propped up by cushions and fed by trembling servants who struggled not to gag at the smell wafting from beneath the table. The court learned to navigate this new reality with practiced denial. Ministers delivered reports while standing as far from the royal bed as protocol allowed. Ladies-in-waiting discovered the art of speaking without breathing, delivering their curtsies and retreating before the full impact of the stench could overwhelm them. Even the king's beloved dogs, once constant companions, now cowered in distant corners, their animal instincts recoiling from the scent of approaching death. Foreign ambassadors faced an impossible diplomatic challenge. How do you conduct serious negotiations with a monarch whose leg is literally rotting off his body? The Venetian envoy wrote cryptically to his government about the unusual atmospheric conditions at Versailles, while the Spanish ambassador requested immediate recall, claiming urgent business in Madrid that everyone knew was fabricated. But Louis himself remained trapped in his own flesh, unable to escape the daily horror of his deteriorating condition. Sleep became impossible as the pain intensified with each passing night. He would lie awake for hours, staring at the painted ceiling of his bedchamber, perhaps contemplating how the cherubs and angels depicted there seemed to mock his earthly suffering. When exhaustion finally claimed him, his dreams were haunted by visions of battlefield corpses and plague victims, his subconscious mind drawing parallels between their fate and his own. The infection began to spread with alarming speed. Black tendrils crept up his thigh like twisted vines, marking the path of the poison as it claimed more territory with each passing day. His physicians, now openly terrified of their patient's condition, spoke in hushed Latin about mortification of the flesh and divine judgment, their medical training proving useless against whatever force was consuming their king from within. Louis's appetite, once legendary among European courts, vanished entirely. The rich foods that had once brought him such pleasure now turned to ash in his mouth. Wine tasted like vinegar, meat like leather, and even the finest delicacies prepared by his master chefs could not mask the metallic taste that seemed to coat his tongue. His body, deprived of nourishment, began consuming itself, leaving his once imposing frame gaunt and hollow. The psychological toll proved equally devastating. The king, who had spent 70 years believing himself chosen by God, now faced the terrifying possibility that his suffering might be divine punishment. He began confessing sins, both real and imagined, to a parade of priests, seeking absolution for everything from his numerous affairs to his costly wars. But no amount of prayer seemed to slow the relentless advance of the corruption in his leg. Madame de Maintenon, his pious second wife, spent hours kneeling beside his bed, her prayers growing more desperate as his condition worsened. She watched the man she had married transform into something barely recognizable, his face gaunt and yellowed, his eyes sunken deep into skull-like sockets. The woman who had once delighted in their private conversations now struggled to understand his fever-induced ramblings as he spoke to long-dead mistresses and commanded phantom armies in battles that existed only in his deteriorating mind. The stench had become so overwhelming that the palace staff began burning vast quantities of incense and perfume, creating a cloying atmosphere that somehow made the underlying rot even more nauseating. Visitors described entering Versailles as walking into a tomb where someone was attempting to mask death with flowers, the sweet and putrid scents combining into something that defied description. By the summer of 1715, even the most optimistic courtiers could no longer pretend that their king might recover. The infection had claimed most of his left leg, turning it into a blackened, swollen mass that bore no resemblance to human flesh. Gangrene had set in with a vengeance, and the resulting toxins were slowly poisoning his entire system. His fever spiked higher each night, leaving him delirious and babbling in languages that seemed to come from the depths of hell itself. The royal physicians, faced with their complete failure, began suggesting increasingly desperate measures. Some proposed amputation, though they knew the king would never survive such surgery in his weakened state. Others whispered about experimental treatments involving fresh blood transfusions from healthy peasants, as if the life force of common people might somehow cleanse the corruption from royal veins. Louis himself seemed to sense that his time was running out. In his few moments of clarity, he would grasp the hands of his attendants with surprising strength, his eyes wild with terror as he begged them not to let him die alone. The Sun King, who had lived his entire life surrounded by crowds of admirers, now faced his greatest fear: that death might claim him, while the courtiers who had once fought for his attention fled from his presence in horror. The stage was set for the final act of this grotesque tragedy, where the most magnificent monarch in European history would discover that all the gold and glory in the world could not purchase a single moment's respite from the democracy of death. The final weeks of August brought fresh horrors that defied even the most morbid imaginations of those who witnessed them. The king's left leg had swollen to grotesque proportions, nearly twice the size of his right. The skin stretched so tight it appeared ready to burst like an overripe fruit. The blackness had spread past his knee, creeping up his thigh with the inexorable advance of some malevolent tide. Courtiers who glimpsed the wound during dressing changes described it as resembling a crater on the surface of the moon, if that crater were filled with putrefying flesh and crawling with maggots. Dr. Fagan had long since abandoned any pretense of medical optimism. His daily examinations had become exercises in barely controlled revulsion, the learned physician forced to breathe through cloth soaked in vinegar just to approach his royal patient. When he changed the bandages, which now required replacement every few hours, the strips of linen came away black with corruption, releasing clouds of fetid vapor that made even the most stoic attendants retch violently. The infection had begun producing its own ecosystem of horror. Flies buzzed constantly around the king's bed, drawn by the sweet stench of decay. Servants discovered that closing the windows only trapped the smell, creating an atmosphere so thick with putrefaction that candles would sometimes gutter and die, as if the very air had become too poisoned to sustain flame. The palace cats, normally comfortable anywhere within Versailles, refused to enter the royal apartments, their primitive instincts warning them away from the scent of approaching death. Louis himself had entered a twilight state between consciousness and delirium. During brief moments of clarity, he would demand mirrors, then immediately order them removed when he glimpsed his reflection. The face that had once been compared to Apollo now resembled a death's head wrapped in yellowed parchment, his eyes sunken so deep they appeared as black holes in his skull. His lips, once full and sensual, had withered to thin lines that struggled to form coherent words. The king's sleep, when it came at all, brought no relief. Attendants reported that he would thrash violently in his fever dreams, crying out names of long-dead enemies and lovers with equal terror. Sometimes he would speak in the voice of a child, calling for his mother who had died decades earlier. Other times, he would bark military commands to invisible armies, his voice cracking as he ordered charges against phantom foes. Most disturbing were the moments when he would simply scream, wordless sounds of agony that seemed to come from some primal place beyond human language. The palace had become a house of whispers and shadows. Servants moved through the corridors like ghosts, speaking in hushed tones about the horror unfolding in the royal bedchamber. Many crossed themselves when passing the king's apartments, as if warding off some supernatural evil. The younger staff members, those who had never known any monarch but Louis, struggled to reconcile the dying creature in the gilded bed with the godlike figure they had been raised to worship. Foreign diplomats found themselves in an impossible situation. Protocol demanded they request audiences with the king, but practical considerations made such meetings exercises in endurance rather than diplomacy. The imperial ambassador lasted exactly 7 minutes in the royal presence before excusing himself with claims of sudden illness. The Pope's envoy, supposedly accustomed to blessing the dying, managed only a hurried benediction before fleeing the chamber with his robes held over his nose. The French nobility faced their own crisis of faith and loyalty. Many had built their entire identities around service to this man who now lay rotting before their eyes. The Duc de Saint-Simon, that sharp-eyed chronicler of court life, wrote in his secret memoirs about the universal horror that had settled over Versailles, describing how grown men wept openly in the corridors, not from grief for their dying king, but from the sheer trauma of witnessing such a grotesque spectacle. Yet even in his extremity, Louis clung to the rituals that had defined his reign. He insisted on receiving the daily reports from his ministers, though he could barely focus on their words through the haze of pain and fever. The mourning lever continued, though now it resembled a macabre parody of its former grandeur. Nobles who had once fought for the honor of attending the king now drew lots to determine who would be forced to witness his daily deterioration. The medical treatments had devolved into pure torture. Dr. Fagan, desperate to show he was doing something, anything, to help his royal patient, ordered the wound to be packed with a mixture of ground emeralds and pulverized mummy, believing these exotic substances might possess healing properties. The result was only more agony for Louis, who would scream so loudly during these applications that guards had to be stationed at the palace entrances to prevent visitors from hearing the royal suffering. Other physicians, summoned from across Europe in a last-ditch effort to save the king, arrived only to recoil in horror at what they found. A famous doctor from Vienna took one look at the putrefying leg and immediately requested permission to return home, claiming his presence was urgently needed elsewhere. A renowned surgeon from London managed to examine the wound, but promptly vomited on the royal carpet, an incident that was hastily covered up by mortified court officials. The psychological impact on Louis himself had become perhaps more devastating than the physical decay. The man who had spent his entire life believing he was chosen by God now faced the terrifying possibility that his suffering might be divine punishment for his sins. He began confessing obsessively to a parade of priests, revealing secrets that made even these hardened men of the cloth blanch with shock. His affairs, his wars, his treatment of religious minorities, his countless acts of pride and cruelty, all poured out in a torrent of fevered confession that seemed to provide no relief from his torment. Madame de Maintenon, his devoutly religious second wife, had taken on the appearance of a woman witnessing the end of the world. She spent entire nights kneeling beside his bed, her prayers growing more desperate as his condition worsened. The woman who had once delighted in theological discussions with her husband now found herself questioning the very foundations of her faith as she watched this anointed king of France consumed by corruption from within. The stench had penetrated every surface of the royal apartments. Tapestries, furniture, even the stone walls themselves seemed to have absorbed the smell of death. Palace staff burned through enormous quantities of perfume and incense, creating clouds of scented smoke that only partially masked the underlying horror. Visitors described the atmosphere as resembling a corrupted church, where the incense of prayer had been mixed with the smoke of hell. By late August, the infection had begun affecting Louis's mind in ways that terrified even his most loyal attendants. He would suddenly bolt upright in bed, his eyes wide with terror, claiming to see armies of the dead marching through his chamber. Sometimes he would speak coherently for hours about events from his childhood, his memory crystal clear about incidents from 60 years past, only to lose all recognition of people who had served him for decades. The gangrene had created its own horrific geography on the king's body. The original wound had spawned satellite infections, black patches that appeared overnight like evil flowers blooming on his flesh. His physicians, now openly admitting their helplessness, could only watch as the corruption spread with mathematical precision, claiming new territory each day in its inexorable advance toward his torso. The palace had become a theatre of the absurd, where the normal rhythms of court life continued alongside this descent into biological horror. Courtiers still competed for positions and gossiped about favour and influence, but now they did so while breathing through perfumed handkerchiefs and fighting back waves of nausea. The contrast between the glittering formality of Versailles and the putrefying reality in the royal bedchamber created a surreal atmosphere that left many questioning their own sanity. Louis's appetite had vanished entirely, his body rejecting even the simplest broths and wines. His physicians forced liquid nutrition down his throat, but his digestive system, poisoned by the toxins seeping from his infected leg, could process nothing. He grew thinner each day, his once imposing frame shrinking until he resembled a scarecrow dressed in royal robes. The transformation was so complete that some courtiers whispered he had been replaced by an imposter, unable to accept that their godlike king could be reduced to such a wasted shell. The nights brought special torments. As darkness fell over Versailles, Louis would begin a nightly descent into delirium that lasted until dawn. He would thrash in his bed, tearing at his bandages and crying out in languages that seemed to come from the depths of madness itself. Attendants learned to restrain his hands to prevent him from clawing at the infected wound, but nothing could stop the verbal torrents of anguish that poured from his lips. Sleep, when it finally claimed him near dawn, offered no peace. His dreams were populated by the ghosts of his victims. Protestant ministers burned for their faith, peasants starved by his wars, nobles executed for treason real or imagined. They stood around his bed in silent accusation, their presence more real to him than the living people who tended his failing body. He would wake screaming their names, begging forgiveness from phantoms that existed only in his guilt-racked mind. The medical profession itself seemed to be on trial in that putrefying chamber. Every remedy known to 17th century medicine had been attempted and found wanting. Bloodletting had only weakened him further. Herbal poultices had fed the infection rather than healing it. Even prayer, that final resort of desperate physicians, seemed to fall on deaf ears as Louis's condition continued its relentless deterioration. The corruption had begun producing sounds of its own, wet sucking noises that emerged from the depths of the wound whenever he moved. Attendants reported hearing these obscene squelches even from outside his chamber, the infected flesh creating its own grotesque symphony of decay. The bandages would make crackling sounds as they were removed, the dried fluids breaking apart like old parchment soaked in filth. By the final days of August, even the most loyal servants had begun abandoning their posts. The combination of the smell, the sounds, and the sheer horror of witnessing their once magnificent king reduced to such a state proved too much for human endurance. Those who remained did so out of duty rather than devotion, their faces covered with cloth, their eyes averted from the spectacle of royal mortality laid bare in all its ghastly reality. The Sun King's light was finally guttering out, but instead of the glorious sunset that might have been expected, this was more like watching a candle drown in its own wax. The man who had illuminated Europe for 7 decades was dying in darkness, consumed by forces that recognized no crown, respected no throne, and bowed to no earthly authority. The final act of this grotesque drama was about to begin, and it would prove even more horrifying than anything that had come before. And so it was that on September 1st, 1715, Louis XIV finally surrendered to the only force that had ever proven stronger than his will. The Sun King died not in glory, but in agony, his final breath escaping from lips that had once commanded the fate of nations. The leg that had betrayed him lay black and swollen beneath silk sheets that could no longer mask the stench of mortality. The courtiers who had spent decades competing for his attention now fled from his presence, leaving him to face eternity with only the smell of his own decay for company. The man who had declared himself the center of the universe discovered in his final moments that bacteria recognize no divine right, that infection bows to no crown, and that death comes for kings and peasants with equal indifference. Perhaps the most chilling lesson of Louis's demise is not that power corrupts, but that corruption eventually consumes even power itself. The monarch who had transformed his body into a stage for statecraft found that stage collapsing beneath him, revealing the rotting foundation upon which all earthly glory rests. In the end, the Sun King's greatest performance was his death, a masterpiece of horror that stripped away every illusion and left only the terrible truth. Beneath every crown lies a mortal skull, and even the brightest sun must eventually set in darkness.